Okay, so my goal is for this video to be quite brief because we've already had 15 minutes of Reagan. This is on George H.W. Bush. There's a few things I want to make sure you understand before we launch in. First of all is that his name is George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush. And he has a son who's also elected president, and his name is George W. Bush. Not exactly the same name, so they're not senior and junior when you refer to them, but I will refer to them by their initials, George H.W. Bush. Notice he's only president for one term, which tells you he kind of suffered the same fate as Martin Van Buren, who's the only other vice president to be elected directly after a president. He also was a one-term president because the vice president elected president usually ends up kind of holding the baggage of the previous president. And I would say that is the case. George H.W. Bush kind of held Ronald Reagan's baggage, both good and bad. An example of that is that communism continued to fall under George H.W. Bush. And, for example, the Berlin Wall that separated East Germany from West Germany fell in 1989. And that's the year I graduated from high school, just to give you a sense of kind of where we were progressing in history. And therefore, Germany was finally reunited for the first time since World War II. Also, the Soviet Union fell apart. If you remember, the Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics, and they all broke away. Georgia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all those Stan countries and others, they became independent nations. And Russia became a country called Russia again for the first time since 1917. This seems like a glorious thing, but George W. Bush was trying to walk a very fine line, George H.W. Bush, because he didn't want to be too elated and like stick it in the eye of the Soviets, because he knew that we needed their continued cooperation, particularly to do things like get the nuclear weapons out of these newly independent states. And so he didn't want to like celebrate too much. At the same time, the public was overjoyed and wanted to see that kind of celebration on the part of the president. So even though that baggage was good baggage to be carrying from the Reagan administration, it was also a little bit tricky. Russia had a new president, and Gorbachev, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Gorbachev was no longer the leader of the non-existent nation, and the new leader of Russia was named Boris Yeltsin. There was an attempt in China to overthrow communism in 1989 as well, so we kind of thought there might be this kind of like anti-communist spring that swept the whole world up. It began with college students, mainly in Tiananmen Square in China, in Beijing, and hundreds of them gathered, and it was thousands in time gathered, and they actually constructed in Tiananmen Square a freedom statue that looked very much like the Statue of Liberty, and there was a lot of hope that perhaps democracy would come to China. But in no short time, that might have lasted about a week, and then Chinese tanks rolled in and killed hundreds of protesters, imprisoned many more, and the memory of this is kind of blotted from the collective Chinese memory because they control their internet there. And if you look up Tiananmen Square on a Google search in China, you see nothing. But it's certainly seared in the memory of the protesters and their families who were a part of this movement and suffered so terribly when it was overthrown. Since this time period, we've seen a slow, steady evolution in China abandoning communism and moving towards capitalism. So now in China, we see social classes and billionaires and millionaires and those things. But we also have seen a continuation of a totalitarian governmental system. So the government isn't changing while the economy is changing. So that's an interesting development. And the question is, how long can that remain in China? Because there are wealthy people who are now exist in China. Everyone's not equal. And the question is the government going to continue to keep them in line over time? So there's a grand experiment going on in China. To what degree can capitalism and totalitarian, authoritarian government coexist, and for what amount of time? One thing that's just a little bit random, but actually fits into a larger narrative, it's kind of the idea of Reagan and Bush is that America is back. Like we are back again strong. The devastation of losing the Vietnam War is over because now we're the only superpower left in the world. And we are continuing to flex a little bit more muscle and influence in the world. One example is in Panama, which is the small country in Central America where we had the canal, if you recall. In 1997, we're going to give the canal back. But before that can happen, we have a problem with their leader. His name is Manuel Noriega, and he is overseeing a huge drug cartel, and he's the kingpin in it. And so the Bush administration is a part of their war on drugs. This kind of war on drugs had started since Nixon was president, really, and had only intensified under Reagan and now George H.W. Bush. So they wanted, as a means of declaring this war on drugs, they wanted to unseat this drug kingpin, Manuel Noriega. So they did. They invaded Panama and arrested Noriega. They actually extradited him from his palace and brought him to Florida. And they tried him, and he was put in federal prison. This is his mugshot. And so this is kind of a testament to the fact that America is back, and we wield influence and power in the world. Imagine if someone, not right now, please. Imagine if someone had come into our country and taken our president out of the White House and taken them back to their country and put him in prison. It's a pretty amazing level of force. Also, while George H.W. was president, we had a problem in Iraq. Iraq had been our friend, and Saddam Hussein, we'd actually given him weapons to help him fight against Iran. But then Saddam Hussein found out that we had secretly sold weapons to Iran, and that we were basically funding both sides of a war. And after that time, Saddam Hussein was kind of done with us and decided that he would invade a nearby country. You can see on the map here that it is the country of Kuwait. And Kuwait is right here. And there's big geopolitical reasons to take over Kuwait. Iraq has a lot of oil, but it'd be great to control this land because it butts right up against this waterway, which connects to world markets. So what happens is that our former friend, now not so much friend, Saddam Hussein, he invades Kuwait. We were sworn to defend Kuwait. Remember that according to the Eisenhower Doctrine, we are going to defend our access to oil in the Middle East. And had this same situation happened in some place that did not have an important natural resource to us, we might have turned a blind eye, but we were not turning a blind eye here. George H.W. Bush is very different than his son. He goes to the United Nations, and he forms a coalition of willing nations to all demand that Iraq get out of Kuwait. We all joined together, and a war happened called Operation Desert Storm, and we defeated Iraq in less than 5 days with less than 400 casualties, and got Iraq out of Kuwait. Now, the problem is that it was not agreed upon by the coalition forces that we would get Saddam Hussein out of power, just that we would get Iraq out of Kuwait. So Saddam Hussein is defeated, but he is still the leader of Iraq. And for the next 10 years, even more than that, he's going to keep kind of like pulling on our chain and making us mad. For example, in the treaty that ended the war, he promised that he would not develop weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear weapons, and that he would let us inspect his country, the old trust but verify idea that Reagan had introduced, that we would be able to inspect. Well, he runs all kind of circles around, well, okay, the inspectors can come here, but they can't come here, and they can't go there, and we're just constantly like playing tug of war with him about it. So much so, actually, that while Clinton is president, he actually bombs Iraq, like key locations in Iraq, to make a point. By the time Clinton leaves the presidency after 8 years and George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, becomes president, he's pretty much done with this whole situation, and he will overthrow Saddam Hussein and invade Iraq preemptively, and we'll be talking more about that later. So I often wonder if the dad and the son go play golf. They both made very different choices about Iraq. George H.W. Bush chose to not overthrow Saddam Hussein and take on an entrenched long-term war in Iraq. His son made a very different choice. We did preemptively attack Iraq, and if you break it, you buy it. It's called the Pottery Barn Rule. We bought Iraq, and we had to pay the price for that for over 10 years. So anyway, I just kind of wonder what they talk about, the golf cart, about that, but I guess I'll never know. All right, in terms of Bush's domestic policies, he inherited all of Reagan's problems, and this is where he really got burned. The debt gets out of control, and Bush realizes it's out of control. And so he had made a pledge not to raise taxes. He said it on camera, read my lips, no new taxes. But then he looked at the debt and he realized this was not sustainable. And so he did end up raising taxes. And that's going to be pounded against him in his re-election bid. Also, he was the guy who had to pardon all the people who had secretly sold the weapons to Iran, and that just looked like really slimy. And then also, Reagan had cut regulations of business, and one of the businesses he had deregulated was banks. And so banks started making loans that were not a good idea, and no one was telling them not to. And so then the banks default on Bush's watch, kind of like Martin Van Buren's. Jackson killed the bank, and Martin Van Buren had to deal with the outcome of that. Similarly, Reagan deregulated the banks. The banks make bad loans. And George H.W. Bush, his vice president, is the one who left holding the bag. He has to bail out all those banks to the tune of billions and billions of dollars, and it just looked bad, and people were mad about it. Economic recession hit in 1990 as well, and it just further weakened his re-election chances. By the time Bill Clinton kind of emerged from the pack of Democrats who were running to challenge George H.W. Bush, Clinton got real clear real fast, his staffers did, that he just needed to keep talking about the economy, and that is what he did, and that is how he defeated George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, at the time of this video, which is January the 7th, 2015, George H.W. Bush is still living. He has recently been hospitalized, though, and is getting very much advanced in age. People looking back on his presidency, though, tend to already seem to be agreeing that he was extremely underappreciated at the time, that his willingness to work with other countries and form a coalition in the United Nations looks really smart now, and his decision to actually not overthrow Saddam Hussein and take on all the expense and devastation of war also looks pretty smart now that we've done that and realized how much more difficult it was than we ever anticipated. Also, he was not a bad guy. He just got lots of baggage from Reagan that he had to deal with. Most people agree that he actually has recently been undervalued as a president, and that probably over the years his stock will rise, kind of like a Truman figure in terms of their evaluation of him. Okay, so that's about it. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in class.